said, kind of the next phase of the presentation talks a little bit about if the city should move forward, what does that process look like? And again, the first thing to keep in mind here is this even right for Taylor? I think there's reasons on both sides of that argument. We've heard from the council both ways on that. And certainly I think the litigation component of it is a really significant risk that the council will need to take into consideration before making a decision on that one way or another. But this next kind of phase of the presentation really just outlines what does that decision-making process look like and what the timeline might be. So as I said, in determining whether or not adult use marijuana is right for Taylor, you may think about doing public meetings or town halls to get input from the public as far as what they think about it. We've heard, obviously, already from the council, I believe the police chief as well, indicating that the majority of Taylor residents, the two-thirds, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood, voted yes on recreational marijuana. So that may be something for the council to take into consideration. One thing that we've seen in other communities, though, is that majority of people voted yes, but they didn't necessarily want it around the block from the house kind of thing. And so, that's certainly true in a number of communities. Obviously, the majority of all communities, probably for the most part, must have voted to allow it, right, because it's a law now. But yet, there's still a significant number of communities that have not opted in, or that have opted out rather, and have not come back around to that issue. So I definitely think there's room to discuss that, and it's not my position to say what's right for Taylor one way or another. I'm just here to facilitate a little bit of education tonight, and maybe some conversation about that. And ultimately, I don't think anybody's asking for a decision, nor would it necessarily be advisable to make that decision tonight. But it is something that should be discussed, probably going into the future to determine what that direction is going to look like.
I agree. We already had a public meeting one time. We've been going through this for 2 years, but not very often. But we did have a public meeting. I suggest we have that again. Invite as many residents here to speak and their opinion on it. I did talk to the lady, I believe it's Everett. There's a big facility up in Everett. And I talked to the city manager there. She recommended not too many because she's seeing in her area south of her that they're closing. But she also said that it was the best decision that your community made. There are 1,800 people. There's 400 employees. They did have problem with smell, but now that they're expanding, they can address that. But I talked to the police chief. Well, I went with our chief, David Solani, talked to the police chief, David Solani, E-Course, and Ann Arbor, and they all say the same thing. It's traffic to start with, but these people, these facilities have been great community partners.
Thank you. So, and this again is if the council were to determine that recreational marijuana were appropriate for Taylor. I think sort of the next discussion piece is we've got all these different types of licenses, 9 different types of licenses or whatever. Which ones of those should be allowed? I think the conversation tends very frequently to be steered more towards the dispensary type locations, without necessarily as much consideration or discussion about what the other types of licenses are and what impacts those would have on the community. For example, if you're dealing with a retail location, and again, we don't have any operational retail locations, but we're talking about marijuana that's already packaged, right? That's going to have a different odor component to it than somewhere is that is growing or processing marijuana, right? And so those are some different things to take into consideration in terms of what types of licenses do we actually want, and then how many, where, and what types of stipulations and land use regulations might be associated with those different types of uses. And again, they are different types of uses. A retail type use may be something that you would look at in an industrial or commercial area. A grow, process, retail sort of kind of has an industrial meaning to it in terms of what the use is. And the city can do whatever it wants in terms of where it zones these things into. Whether it be any license type in the industrial corridor or all spread out throughout the city, or even using overlay districts as other communities have done. But these are all things that I think need to be talked about sort of in order, right? Once you decide which licenses you think would be desirable, it only makes sense then to talk about where do you put them, how many should there be, and, you know, how spread out do we want these things?
So in discussing about the types, and this may be the easiest, if you go to the second page of Westlands, they've got a chart. And you mentioned, I think, 9 different types. They've got, you know, a 2x5 matrix. So within, do they restrict from other available options, or?
So that chart that you're referring to is just a list of what the